McKusick, that's A-N-N-E, M-C, capital K-U-S-I-C-K.
Okay, and can you tell us where you were born and a little bit about...
Yes, I was born in Rochester, New York. My father was a physicist and was at Eastman Kodak Company. He had many young men working for him who eventually ended up in Oak Ridge because they were looking for physicists, and they drew heavily on the development department at Kodak. One of the concerns in Oak Ridge was run by Tennessee Eastman, and another by DuPont, and another by Carbon and Carbide. I worked in Y12 for Tennessee Eastman. I came first, about the 1st of April, well, I think exactly the 1st of April, 1944. And the first thing I noticed on my trip from Knoxville to Oak Ridge, which was a 40-mile jaunt, that the people around me were making 3 syllables out of 2-syllable words, or even 1-syllable words. And the Southern accent was new to me. For about a week after our arrival, we were in a kind of a study where we were trained to secrecy. We were told how important it was to the whole war effort that we not be talking. And this was really drilled in. And I remember that later, a friend of Ted Rockwell's came to Oak Ridge, and his name was Mac Barrett, and he came to lunch with, or breakfast with, 7 of us in Knoxville. And he said in a loud voice in the restaurant, "I understand you have about 75,000 people working out there." With one accord, the 7 of us at the table all leaned forward and said, "Shh." Our brainwashing was complete. We really were very well drilled. At the end of the war, when the radio was blaring out that the war was ended and, oh no, that the bomb had been dropped, then we all felt, oh, why don't they turn off that radio? You know, this is going to, you know, this was all wrong. So I think it was amazing that in about a week at the beginning of our time there, the secrecy was so well ingrained because it was quite complete.
That aspect of things, or just launch into, you know,
what we were doing.
What you were doing.
Yes. Well, I think that ought to come next, maybe. Okay. We were separating isotopes. Now we were separating uranium-235 from uranium-298. I hope that's right.
We can start again. It's 235 from 238.
Thank you, 238. I knew it was wrong. So it was, but of course we weren't calling anything by its proper names. Absolutely everything had a code name or a number. And we had memorized the book about what we were doing in terms of different names and numbers. And so if we were on shift work and we were having to fill the 714 traps, we weren't even much conscious of the fact that this was liquid nitrogen, but we were working where there was a huge magnet, and the isotopes were separated in a strong magnetic and electric field. and this separated them on the basis of mass. And uranium-235, having a different mass than uranium-238, was separated. There were other methods being tried in other parts of Oak Ridge, but we hardly knew they were going on. There was one at X10 that was sponsored by DuPont. There was one at K25 that was under the direction of carbon and carbide. We knew the occasional person. I don't remember knowing anyone from X10, but I did know a couple from K25. A friend of ours, a very gregarious friend, whose father had been president of Carbon and Carbide, used to bring around people occasionally who worked for the Carbon and Carbide division in Oak Ridge. So secrecy certainly prevailed and kept from a lot of interaction. We had separate buses that took us from the entrance to the Y12 area from the town site in Oak Ridge to the Y12 area, different one to the X10 area, another one to the K25 area. And we didn't even know anything about the destinations of these other buses. It was a very interesting place to work. At one time, I was running around and checking on what research projects were going on in different parts of Y12, and trying to keep track of the progress they were making, but always in these coded terms. I remember one time Frank Oppenheimer, who worked in Oak Ridge, was wanting someone who could jot down a lot of stuff about a particular result, and I was the one jotting down what he had under his direction, what he wanted to remember. We never met J. Robert Oppenheimer in Oak Ridge. I did meet him later when I went to Berkeley, but there was a project going on, XBX, that was adjacent to Y12, and the people from Berkeley were working there. One time, Ernest Lawrence paid a visit to Oak Ridge, and there was very little going on in the way of social life in Oak Ridge, but I remember they held a dance, and I did dance with Ernest Lawrence. The life in Oak Ridge was very casual. I remember being dressed up for work, but after work we were wearing blue jeans all the time. And I lived in a house with 5 other girls, no one of whom was in physics. In fact, at the time I came, I was the only girl who'd studied physics. We had very interesting conversations sometimes about, particularly I remember talking about puzzles, and this would be a group effort of solving a particular puzzle where everyone put in 2 cents, and that was fun. It was, we went on picnics in our off time. What we did most of the time was sing. This was, I was not limited in this the way I should have been, because I can barely carry a tune. But I remember there were there were three boys that used to, three or four, that used to arrive at our house, and they'd be sounding a note, and then the others would join in a barbershop quartet sort of style. And this was our entertainment largely. Picnics were one thing. On Sundays, I went with two girls with whom I lived to Norris Lake, which was by Norris Dam, and we went fishing. That was something that we did occasionally. I also remember that this was wartime, and tires were very bad. You didn't ever buy new tires. You always patched what you had. Norman Rockwell and Ted Rockwell and Norman Carter, who had been friends at Princeton, bought a car together, and occasionally we went places. That car had some problems. We borrowed the car from a brother of one of my roommates, Bob Devenish, and we got very much accustomed to changing tires. So much so that when my mother was visiting Oak Ridge one time and was rushing to get to the airport, in Bob Devenish's car, we were rushing her there, we had a flat on the way. The boys started to change the tires, but the girls thought they were being too slow at it, so we took over. And we had had so much practice with that car that it was repaired. It was changed swiftly, and we got her to the airport on time. There were all sorts of surprises. I remember Isabel was one of my roommate. I was in the house with Isabel Devenish and Jean Benham, with whom I'd gone to kindergarten. And Isabel was a very good cook. And I really wanted to do some of the cooking, and I knew I wouldn't have a chance if Isabel found out that I had almost never cooked before. So that was a secret. And finally, I was accepted as one of the cooks. We had we worked 6 days a week, and so the one day off was very precious. There was once that we had a holiday coming along, and somehow or other had 2 days off, so we decided that was the time to go on a trip to Myrtle Beach. And I went, by this time, Isabel's sister, Kathleen, was there in Oak Ridge. And she and I and Bob Devenish and a friend of Bob's drove to Myrtle Beach, which was 500 miles away, and back on our 2 days off. We didn't have a lot of time for sitting on the beach, but it was and I remember coming back through the Smoky Mountains where the roads were very curving and it was dark, and fortunately Bob's car had a light on top, and so one of us, the one who wasn't driving, and it was Kathleen and I that seemed to be doing the driving on the way back, it would keep the light focused on the road ahead so that we could drive as fast as possible. We did make it back within the allotted time, but it was a strenuous trip. Well, anyway, you don't want to know all this. Let me think what some of the other, there was always something unusual happening. One time, somebody in the development department at Kodak sent down a camera that could go inside the unit that was separating, it was called the D, was separating isotopes, and and look at various sparking that was taking place that we wanted to know about. And I remember that I stayed up I kept working beyond my 8-hour shift, and ended up staying up about 24 hours over that little project. I don't know that it reached a conclusion, but we did. We had some liberty about time spent at work, but we never took time off. It was a six-day a week work week. We had various adventures, and you might have heard about some cave exploration we did one time. Maybe not. Okay. Well, this was really hair-raising, and it was probably the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. Six boys owned a boat, and one of them was there on this particular day. Then two of the three that dropped by our house not infrequently were there, and there was a total, and Jean Benham and Isabel Devenish and I were there. Ted Rockwell was there. Lynn McCabe was there. Norman Carter was not, and Dick Hoff was the other one of the six owners of the boat, who was present. And he was terribly important because he was the only one who'd explored the cave before. And we did not have any Ariadne ribbon to be trailing along behind us. We had a miner's lamp that had calcium carbide crystals in it, or pebbles. And when those got damp, they formed acetylene gas, and this made an acetylene torch. We were using this for illumination, and Dick Hoff was telling us what we were coming to, and there was one place where there was a 60-foot drop-off beside the path we were walking, and we were to be very careful not to slip. We went along in this unlighted cave, except for the miner's lamp, and finally we came to a place where we had to crawl on our tummies. There was not enough room from below us to above us to walk on our knees. So we were actually crawling along on our stomachs, trying to get to the end of this passage, which we were assured was coming. We finally got to a room where the cave opened out into some place. There was a drop-off down into this room, but not, I think, too big a drop-off, maybe 8 or 10 feet. At this point, I decided that I would never make it back up again if I went into a lower room. So I elected to stay. Now, this meant staying in the dark, which I did, hoping that the others would return sometime. They went off down into this lower room. After a while, Jean Benham came back and waited with me at the top. And again, we waited in the dark. Now, we were not smoking. We did not smoke. But there were members of the group who were smoking. And, of course, we could have had an explosion had we realized that there was going to be acetylene gas in a damp cave where pebbles had been thrown out. So this is a good example of some of the risks young people can get into, and without having enough fear to be cautious. So when they came to get back up from this lower room, they were pushing Lynn McCabe into a waterfall, and so that took a while to get him back up again, and there was someone below helping to push him up. Then we had to go back the whole long way that we had come. It was dark, only the miner's lamp, and I remember we were singing hymns at that stage. And we were singing, "When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there." and finally, we could see a little light ahead, and we got back to where we'd started. Now, at this point, it had gotten quite cold outside. I think it was October 15th. And the reason I remember the date was that we probably should have known it would be cool. We did not have on terribly warm clothes. The boat had a limited amount of gasoline, and Lynn McCabe was very worried that there wasn't enough gas to get back to Norris Lake and Norris Dam. And he said, "We're going to have to spend the night on the boat." At this point, Isabel said, "I will swim to my aunt in La Follette." And of course, I was ready to swim with her. But anyhow, the three girls were not. No way were we going to spend the night on the boat. So there was some real dissension about this, because Lynn knew that in the dark they were going to have a terrible time finding their way back, and we could run out of gas and be absolutely stranded. Isabel had a very keen sense of direction, and we never would have gotten back if it hadn't been for her choices about which route to take in the dark, because there were many branchings of this extension of Norris Lake. And she'd say, "I think it's this way." And she wasn't at all sure, but she had good intuition. And they followed her suggestions, and eventually here were the lights of Norris Dam, and we were back. And there were some that were, again, on shift work, and and Norman Carter was back there expecting that he would be relieved at the end of his shift at 11 o'clock, and it was 2 a.m. when we got back to Oak Ridge. So it was just full of uncertainty. But anyhow, we all made it, and it was an experience we'll never forget. Is there anything you'd like to know about Oak? We lived in a house for 6 girls. The government, the Army, decided later that they could put 12 girls in the house, and so they decided that they would put double-decker beds in every one of the 3 bedrooms. I had one roommate to start out with. Later, if it had been fair, I should have had 3 roommates, and a total of 4 in the room. I think the house had 1 bathroom. I certainly know they wouldn't have had 2. I remember where the 1 was. It was a time when there was rationing of meat and sugar, and when someone came to dinner, he really if it were a big feast or something, he surrendered a few ration stamps to allow to compensate for what he was using up. We had long lines at the grocery store because of the rationing.
Can you tell us the address of that house? Do you remember where it was?
Yes, I think I can. It was.
Can you start with the house was?
The house was on Norman Lane because it was off New York Avenue, and the streets off avenues began with the same letter as the avenue. The administration people were up on Outer Drive, which ran to which the streets named for states ran into. We were at 101 Norman Lane. We were on the almost on the corner of Norman Lane and New York Avenue. One time we had a garden party. Now our lawns were not developed at all, but Jean and Isabel and I decided that we would invite friends to a garden party and they could make the lawn. So they came, and it was. I think we did make some progress in that direction. There were a couple of the guests who thought maybe it was a bit of a raw deal, but it was one of the Oak Ridge adventures.
Can you remember where you shopped? How did you
yes.
walk from there?
Yes, there was a shop on New York Avenue that was just about opposite Norman Lane, and I don't know whether it's still there or not, but there was a grocery store, and we did buy things there. One time, we had he wasn't exactly a burglar, but he was a friend of one of the girls in the house who came to help himself to something in the refrigerator in the night. And I remember we did not have a telephone in the house. There was a telephone out at the street, on Norman Lane at the opposite our house. And Isabel was the brave one who ran out to the telephone to notify the authorities that there was an intruder in the house. And so we kept him from helping himself to things out of the refrigerator. But it was someone we thought was having a lot of nerve to come there in the middle of the night.
Did the security people come?
I actually met a cousin of a first cousin of the man who was later to become my husband, when Wayne McKusick and his wife Betty came to look at a piano that was in our house. I don't remember much else about the piano because our singing was all a cappella. but Wayne and Betty came to look at the piano, and I'm not sure, I don't think they bought it. I think it had some other fate, destination. So, when I later decided to go to medical school, Wayne McKusick told me that he had a cousin at Johns Hopkins, and I think by that time I had been occasionally visiting relatives of my sister's in-laws who lived in Baltimore and who had a lot to say about Johns Hopkins and what a wonderful place it was. So at that point, Wayne McKusick said, well, I have a cousin at Johns Hopkins, and that was all I heard about that until I had been in medical school I went out first to Berkeley to catch up on pre-medical subjects that I had never had, and took biology and comparative anatomy and zoology 101 or 1A and zoology 1B. And since I went out there in February, I had to take the courses that were being given at that time of year, so I had to take them backwards. I had to start with comparative anatomy and ended up at the very end of the summer with zoology 1A. So it was, that was a kind of an iffy time, because one mentor was very encouraging about my taking things backwards, whereas, and I remember their names too, it was Morgan Harris, who was so very encouraging, and another one who wasn't, and who said, you physicists think you have the world by the tail. And anyway, they let me do it, and I started out, I think, dissecting a cat before I had even done a dogfish. I came to the dogfish later, but I used to, I was living by that time in Berkeley, and I was used to bring my cat home so that I could work on it a little bit at home on dissection, and I had to keep it out on my balcony and be very quiet about what I was doing. But that was fun. While I was there, I decided to go to some physics lectures because they had some very good seminars going on, and I remember going to a few of those and meeting J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was there at Berkeley. And he was there, and there were a lot of legends that went with him. It ended up being very interesting. I used to walk to work by the home of an old lady who was sometimes out in her garden. And when she had gotten wind of the, well, I'm getting ahead of my story, but she'd gotten wind of the fact that I was going to go to Hopkins Medical School, and she said, my father was the first president of Johns Hopkins, and I think he had also been an early president of University of California at Berkeley. So she said there were only 4 houses in Berkeley when we came here, and her name was Elizabeth Gilman. And so I had this little preview. I might say that I had to have my interview for Johns Hopkins while I was there in Berkeley. This is not the part you're interested in, but we went, someone drove me there, a girl in my house, and we ended up going up a one-way street the wrong way with a cable car coming down, and she fortunately drove into the one empty space on the street, and the cable car going by just tipped her back bumper, but we got there, and I had an interview with a surgeon from Johns Hopkins whom I felt was very very imposing, and it was a little scary because I was not at all sure I had was going to get a recommendation from him for admission. It was he'd asked me to do a lot of things at the same time, such as writing a reference, which I'd never done before, and answering a lot of questions about how I'd gotten along at Cornell. And my AB was from Cornell. So that was scary, but I had applied to only 2 medical schools, to Cornell and to Hopkins. And I had done fairly well at Cornell, so I thought this was going to be my backup. But the day before I had the interview, I learned that I had not been admitted to Cornell Medical School, so everything hinged on this interview. And it was a challenging time, but I was admitted, and so that was very lucky.
So you were telling us about meeting J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Yes.
Can you describe what he was like and how people felt about him?
Well, I think they were very impressed. You know, they were. There was a girl who was in physics there. Now, there was about 1 other girl who eventually came to Oak Ridge in physics, but this was not usual. I'm sure that the reason I went into physics in the first place was because my father was in physics, and I guess I thought that my father was in physics, my uncle, his younger brother was in physics. They'd both come from Canada to do graduate work. Uncle John had gone to Yale and then to Cornell, and my dad had spent his entire time at Yale, and so I thought that that there'd be nothing to this. I think I had an eye-opening experience in Oak Ridge in that it wasn't clear that you could rely on the fact that your ancestors had studied physics to make sure you were going to be able to make a contribution. I had been fooled a bit by the fact that in high school I was in a group that was allowed to progress at my own rate. This was a new experiment. The last half of my, this was a new experiment at Monroe High School in Rochester, New York, and we were like a one-room schoolhouse in that there were people from the 8th grade through the 12th in the same classroom, and sometimes we were doing the same things. If we were doing plays for English, the whole group, we had 8th graders participating as well as seniors. I was one of 6 seniors in my classroom. There were 2 classes, each of 30, that were trying this experiment. Well, anyway, I remember that I had decided at that time to go into physics, and I enjoyed it greatly at both McMaster, where I went for 3 years in Hamilton, Ontario, and at Cornell, where I finished up in the last year and a half. Now, there weren't any other girls in physics at the time I was taking that in Cornell. There were 2 other math majors at McMaster, but no other girls in physics. So when I got to Oak Ridge, it was perhaps not surprising that there were no girls who were physicists. And I remember somebody saying to me once, do you consider that you're a girl who happens to be a physicist or a physicist who happens to be a girl? So anyway, the only other woman who'd studied physics at the time I was there which was April 1st, 1944 to late in December of 1945. There was only one other girl who came later, and I think her name was Mildred Cranock, and I think she had studied some physics. But it was just that women weren't thought to be capable of learning the subject, or thought that it was strictly a man's field at that time. By the time I got to Berkeley, there was a woman physicist who was very surprised that I was considering leaving the field. And she said, you know, you're needed as a role model. You can't be dropping this now. But I felt that in high school, they had encouraged, they had said, they had decided that you weren't necessarily going to have ideas that were setting the world on fire, but there'd be something you could do if you had, there's something that group could do somewhere. And certainly everybody in the group, except 2 people, did go on to college. And that, I think, was one of the things that that encouraged me to think that I could stick with physics, but I really wasn't going to be making a contribution, or the kind of contribution I wanted to make. So I then decided to leave it and study medicine. And you asked me about what I remembered of J. Robert Oppenheimer. I think he had a reputation for being absent-minded, but that isn't the... he was very impressive, and I think that graduate students at Berkeley were in awe of him. When let's see if there's anything else you should know. There were some very good physicists there that had come from Kodak, Julian Webb being one, and he was someone I had known since I was a small child, because he worked in the development department. I worked most closely for Dr. William Arnold when I was in XAX, and he eventually, he was interested in photosynthesis and had previously worked in photosynthesis, and went on to do make his major contribution in that area. I remember one time I was in a small group, and Dr. Roy Goslin, who came from University of Oklahoma, was there also, and Dr. Arnold, and we had decided, and a couple of others, somebody Baroni was in the group, we had decided that in our spare time we would learn set theory. And this had not been taught in the math courses that I had taken, either at McMaster or at Cornell. So it was my turn to play teacher, and here was this imposing group. And I remember banging with my fist on the desk and saying, "Will the class please come to order?" Which was, it was just one of the fun things. Oh, I should tell you one story. I was also taking Russian lessons at one stage, and I'd had about 10 Russian lessons, and I was carrying my textbook, which was written by somebody named Bondar, and the name of it was The Russian Method. I came in, we had this outer rim of security checks, and then another where we entered Y12, where we worked. And within Y12, I was working in the XAX building. When I entered Y12, there was a guard who looked at what I was carrying. He saw Blondar's The Russian Method. He immediately called the captain of the guard, and he said, "I have a woman here who has the Russian method. What shall I do with her?" Well, it wasn't so long after that that they decided not to have Russian lessons anymore on the Oak Ridge territory. This was given by a white Russian, and so we had barely made a start on learning the language. But that was the kind of security scrutiny to which you were exposed.
That's great. I'm trying to think about what we might help people understand about what it was like to be
in Oak Ridge.
Yeah, to be in Oak Ridge. Just some more memories about, that was excellent, and the security guard, or even your work, the daily routine. I know Bill Wilcox, that name ring a bell. He worked at Y12, but I think he was a chemist.
Yeah.
So he was involved when they took the tray out with the isotopes and went through the chemistry process to separate out or clean off the trays. So
yes.
And then there's another sort of famous story about the fact they had to borrow silver from the U.S. Treasury to rewind some of the magnets.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you were part of that. And then
no, but I knew, I did hear the story somewhere, and yes, and of course, I think they borrowed silver from Fort Knox, hadn't they, for this. There was not a lot of detail that we absolutely knew, but that was a rumor that got around, and it was a tremendously exciting time. My first exposure to the amount of energy that was released came when I was studying at McMaster, and I heard that there was enough, I hope my figures are accurate, that there was enough energy released from 1 gram of fissionable material to send the Queen Mary back and forth across the ocean 4 times. So this was pretty impressive. It was that's what my father was thinking about when I was job hunting after Cornell, and my excitement about this, and when I reported it to the family after learning it. And he said, "Well, I think this is something you're going to be interested in." But anyway, it was I wasn't involved in any of the cleanup of the Ds or anything like that. I wasn't really involved in any of the methods about separation of isotopes. I was just one of the young people employed. Now, I know that Ted Rockwell got into a lot more, some very interesting projects at Oak Ridge, and he, of course, stayed much longer in nuclear energy, like his whole life.
Can you say something about innovation? Were there sort of innovative aspects of what you did?
I think in everyday living, there are always surprises. they used to joke about them when we'd be waiting for a bus. The saying was, shall we wait for the bus or wait till they've built the town out to us? Because they were building at a very rapid rate. They did have a tremendous number of construction workers on hand in Oak Ridge, and everybody was very busy. They were putting up dormitories at a rapid rate out in West Village. They probably don't even call it West Village anymore. There was Townsite, and there was West Village. I might say that the social life, in the social life, they were all group activities. One time, the three, I probably shouldn't tell this story, but the three boys who came to our house so frequently said, the three of us would like you to go to a dance in West Village with us. And so we got all dolled up, not in the usual blue jeans, but dressed up for the occasion. And the three of us went with the three of them to the dance. There was one time they said, the three of us would like the three of you to marry us. And, we knew that was a joke. But living was full of surprises. I could probably be quoting more if I could remember them, but it's a little hard to remember everything clearly at this stage. And this is at least 67 years later.
Oh, I know.
So,
name Wildcat Den.
What?
Do you remember the name Wildcat Den? Apparently they had a soda fountain there and a dance floor, and it's now on Oak Ridge Turnpike, not far from the libraries in Tulane Avenue. It's Robinson Road.
Okay.
And Oak Ridge Turnpike connect there, and it was,
yes.
It's a World War II era building where supposedly there were dances. But or did you go to the tennis courts below the guest house?
I didn't go to dances on the tennis courts. That came after my time. Remember that I left there at the end of 1945. And I think I've heard Ted talk about dances on the tennis courts, but I think that this was after I had left Oak Ridge. There was very little regular entertainment when I was there, and the dance at West Village was a really exceptional event. I'm trying to think. I seem to remember having played tennis once, though, and that was obviously on the Oak Ridge tennis courts. I remember that one time I had a date with Ted Rockwell, and we went out and ran into somebody called John Topham, whom I was meeting for the first time then. He worked at K25 in construction. He was a college dropout whose father had been president of Carbon and Carbide. He talked to Ted and me for some time, and he was a very valuable talker, and he was a friend of this group that used to come to my house from that time forward. He had married early. His wife was living in, I think, Virginia. Well, I'm sure. He came from Whiteville, and he was a very adventuresome, very bright guy who in later life, built Midtown Plaza in Rochester, New York. This was a new idea where cars went in from the so traffic went in from the periphery to the center, and there were shopping facilities and so on there. Later on, this of course was reversed when people were going from inner city to outside to shop and to various businesses. John Topham later built the New York building at the World's Fair. That was not the one when I was 16, but there was a New York World's Fair.
64.
Thanks. And that, so the New York State building was his, that he had designed and put together. He's been interested in the arts. He's been interested in a variety of things. He's traveled a lot in Saudi Arabia, got to know the royal family, was really on good terms with the royal family, and collected tents from all of mohair tents made of goat hair from all over Saudi Arabia. Brought them back and had an exhibit at the Textile Museum in Washington, where the whole museum, I think, was given over at one time to an exhibit of John's tents. He's someone I hear from once in a while, every few years. My sister has retired to Rochester, New York from living in Potomac for 30 years. She and her husband went back to Rochester and are in a retirement home there. One time recently I was visiting them for Christmas, and John Topham did come by, and so some of the Oak Ridge was such a powerful force for such a bond that the people we knew in Oak Ridge have sort of been friends ever after. I knew Ted and Mary Rockwell very well in Oak Ridge, and Mary didn't get there until a little later, which is why she didn't figure in some of the early stories. But when she arrived, she was very much a part of the gatherings, and I remember that I did see her once after I'd gotten to medical school, and she came to visit someone who was the wife of someone in the pathology department, and then one time the Rockwell family came over, and we went tubing in a very, now this was after the tall ships had come into Baltimore Harbor, which would have been 1976, so the Rockwells and the McKusick's went tubing on Western Run. It was too cold, too late in the year to be tubing, and we were frozen. But we had left the car downstream from where we started, so there was no alternative but to keep going downstream. We were really cold by the time we got back to the car. But anyway, that was just one more follow-up on Oak Ridge contacts.
One question that we ask everybody is, first of all, did you know what the work was that you were, was the result or contribute to making an atomic bomb?
No. No.
Because no one's not asking questions, so you have to sort of answer it in a way that...
Yes, we knew that we were doing something that was very important in the war effort. Now, I think we did know. We didn't know that they were going to drop a bomb. We didn't know that that if they dropped a bomb, it wouldn't be on some isolated atoll. We were not, I was not savvy enough to put together what other things were. I remember someone talking about thorium and how that made him suspicious that this was. I don't remember knowing much of anything about fissionable materials. I hadn't read a lot about early studies of Hahn and Strassman or Meitner, and I really was quite unversed, but I know that I remember talking to Ted about what was going on at the Argonne lab, speculating about what was going on, because we certainly didn't know, but being a little concerned that they were being careful enough not to set a chain reaction in motion. And that, you can see that my information was really very limited.
So what about, how did you feel once you learned that we had dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima?
We were really horrified. I think the fact that the extent of the damage really wasn't known initially. I suppose that we thought, well, this is what we've been working for, and we were terribly anxious to have our project completed before Germany did something, did it, or Japan. We weren't so aware of the possibility of of being scooped by the Japanese as we were by the Germans. I think that it was all speculation, and I really didn't know too much about it.
So any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to make about your experience in Oak Ridge and the Manhattan Project?
It was absolutely unforgettable. We said at the time, this is something we'll tell our grandchildren about. And we knew that it was tremendously exceptional, what we were working on, that it hadn't been done before. And I think it was such an exciting time of life. It was truly for young people, a most wonderful experience. We weren't seeing it from the same point of view as the housewives who were trying to cope with the mud getting into their houses and who were very concerned about that. One of them told me that when some help would arrive at her house, and this was Marcia Neely, whose husband was a lawyer in Oak Ridge, the maid would pour a gallon of water in the front door and then proceed to sweep it out. And this was to cope with the mud. And sometimes you'd lose a shoe in the mud. The shoe would simply stick, and you'd be trying to get it out again. And there were times when they were always making cartoons about the absurd, and one of them was a picture of an arm sticking out of the mud, holding a badge for the man at the gate of Y12, and it was just something so full of surprises. But to the young people, this was excitement, and this was something quite wonderful. And to others that were looking for the same thing that they had, who were looking to a stable existence, it was.
Great. Well, that's terrific. Monica, can you think of anything else you'd like to add?
You know, there are probably other things, but they're not coming to mind right now.
Well, you were terrific.
Well, you mentioned that you danced with Ernest Lawrence.
I beg pardon?
You mentioned that you danced with Ernest Lawrence.
Lawrence, yes.
What were your impressions of Ernest Lawrence?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was terribly interested. Now, I had worked at Kodak in the summer, and I'd worked in the Research Building 59 and in the sensitometry department, and there was someone there by the name of Kelly Nelson who had worked with Ernest Lawrence, and I remember talking to Dr. Lawrence about him. You know, he was a very nice person and very pleasant. I knew that we'd heard about EOL at work, and I knew he'd invented the cyclotron. So all these things should have given me, I think did give me, I knew we were separating isotopes, certainly, but as far as what they'd be used for, I really didn't know.
That's great.